Warning: the following video contains information about murder and actions of evil individuals. Viewer discretion is advised.
There are some stories that never quite leave the public imagination, not because we want to hold on to them, but because they never fully resolve. They linger in that grey space between mystery and injustice, and few cases capture that feeling more sharply than the murder of Julie Ward. Julie Ward was a young British woman, bright, adventurous and full of life. She was a wildlife photographer who went to Kenya in 1988 hoping to capture the landscapes and animals she'd always dreamed of seeing. But instead, her name would become associated with one of the most troubling and controversial murder cases in modern times. A case that would expose deep problems in international justice, government cover-ups and the determination of a father who refused to give up. This is the story of Julie Ward, a case that begins in the vast beauty of the African savannah and descends into a decades-long fight for truth. Hello true crime fans and welcome to Behind the Yellow Tape. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe. The videos take a long time to make and it really does help. Also, please comment on what you think happened to Julie, who was responsible and if you believe there was a cover-up. Julie Ann Ward was born in 1960 in Suffolk, England. She was the middle child in a close family, outgoing, artistic and deeply in love with nature. Her father, John Ward, was an architect, and her mum, Janet, kept a warm home full of encouragement and curiosity. From an early age, Julie had this fascination with photography. She wasn't necessarily the kind of person drawn to bright lights or celebrity. Instead, she loved the quiet patience of watching wildlife. The way you need to wait for the exact moment when light filters through the trees or when an animal turns its head. By the time she reached her 20s, she trained as a photographer and worked in a publishing company, saving every spare penny for travel. In 1988, she took what you might call a dream trip, heading out to Africa for a several-month journey through Kenya, Tanzania and beyond. Her plan was to document animals in the wild for her portfolio. She was only 28 years old. Julie was independent but careful. She planned her route, had friends along the way and even kept her father updated regularly. Kenya in the late 1980s wasn't necessarily dangerous for tourists, but it was a country governed under the authoritarian rule of President Daniel Moi. Corruption was widespread, but most travellers considered safari areas like the Masai Mara safe enough. That sense of safety would prove tragically misplaced. Fast forward to early September 1988. Julie and a friend, Dr. Glenn Burns, a wildlife researcher from Australia, had been touring national parks, but their Land Rover had mechanical trouble and Julie stayed behind near the Sand River Gate of the Masai Mara Reserve while Burns went back to Nairobi to get parts. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. A few days later, when Burns returned, Julie wasn't there. Her belongings were still at the campsite, but she was gone. At first, there was some confusion. Maybe she'd gone off exploring or joined another group. But deep down, Burns must have known something was wrong. Julie wasn't the type to vanish without a trace. Her disappearance was reported to Kenyan authorities, but from the very first day, communication was chaotic. The Masai Mara is huge, hundreds of square miles of rolling savanna, forests and rivers. A missing person search there is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Then, on the 13th of September 1988, the searchers made a discovery. In a remote area near the Sand River, they found parts of a burnt body and some personal belongings that appeared to be Julie's. But the conditions of the remains made identification difficult. Officials quickly concluded it was an accident. They said maybe she'd been struck by lightning or perhaps attacked by animals, and her remains burned by a brush fire. Very odd explanations. But that became the official story at first. An accident. Nothing criminal, no foul play. Her father, back in Britain, was immediately suspicious. John Ward had raised his daughter to be careful, and he knew Julie wasn't careless or reckless. When Kenyan police suggested lightning or wild animals, he didn't buy it. He decided he wouldn't rest until he knew the truth. So John Ward got on a plane to Kenya. Within a week of hearing the news, he was on the ground in Nairobi, trying to understand what had happened to his daughter. Imagine that, flying halfway across the world, stepping into a foreign bureaucracy, trying to make sense of your child's death, while everyone else around you insists it was just an unfortunate accident. When John arrived in the Masai Mara, he met local officials and police. He asked to see the scene, the remains and the photographs, but he quickly noticed the inconsistencies. First, the remains had been tampered with before he even arrived. Second, there were burn marks on the bones that didn't line up with a natural fire or lightning strike. Third, some of the remains were found separately, carried off it seemed, and partially buried. It was becoming obvious that Julie didn't die from exposure or lightning. She had been killed, and then her body had been burned, probably in an attempt to hide the evidence. But why were Kenyan authorities insisting otherwise? John Ward's instincts were right. He began to suspect that someone, perhaps someone connected to the powerful interests in Kenya, was trying to cover up a murder, and he decided he wouldn't let that happen. Back in the late 1980s, getting information across countries wasn't as quick as today. You couldn't just email Scotland Yard or post on social media. John Ward started writing letters to MPs, to the Foreign Office, to journalists. He demanded that British authorities get involved. At first, the British government was cautious. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office tended to trust its Kenyan counterparts. They didn't want to interfere with an ongoing investigation. But John Ward didn't stop. He returned to Kenya multiple times, hired private detectives, and even paid forensic experts to re-examine the scene. Over time, he discovered more and more disturbing facts. For one, some of Julie's body parts had been hidden. Her head was found separately from her other remains, and the bones showed knife marks, cuts that couldn't have been caused by animals or fire. That meant she had been mutilated after death. As word spread, the press picked up the story. The British tabloids were horrified. The narrative shifted from a tragic accident to a potential cover-up in Kenya's prized national park, a tourist paradise. And that, of course, created political pressure. Kenya depended heavily on tourism. Having a murdered British tourist headline didn't sit well with the government, especially one already accused of corruption. So the authorities doubled down, issuing new explanations that contradicted each other. It was lightning, then it was suicide, then it was possibly lions. Each time the evidence disagreed. John Ward never wavered. He was methodical, professional. He approached it like an engineer solving a design flaw. He gathered witness statements, coordinates, photographs, and expert reports. He even interviewed people the police ignored, park wardens, mechanics, and nearby tourists. And the more he found out, the more obvious the gaps became. By the early 1990s, the official story had completely unravelled. British politicians were asking questions in Parliament. The Foreign Office, embarrassed by public criticism, finally agreed to push Kenyan authorities for a full murder investigation. Kenya reluctantly reopened the case, and in 1991, 3 men were charged. Among them, a senior wildlife officer named Simon Lisinko and a park warden named Jonah Angain. But the trial was chaotic, almost theatrical. Evidence was missing, witnesses changed testimonies, and eventually all 3 men were acquitted. To many observers, it looked like a staged prosecution, a way for Kenya to show action while guaranteeing no convictions. Still, John persisted. He kept asking who would benefit from silencing Julie. Was she a witness to something she shouldn't have seen, or was her death a random act of violence covered up to protect the park's image? No one could say for sure, but the pattern suggested the truth was being deliberately buried. Eventually, under sustained pressure, the British government sent Scotland Yard investigators to assist. That was unusual. Foreign detectives rarely got jurisdiction inside Kenya, but John's campaign left them little choice. The Scotland Yard team confirmed what John had believed all along. Julie Ward had been murdered, killed with a sharp instrument, dismembered and burned. They found no evidence to support theories of lightning, animals or suicide. But confirming a murder and actually finding a murderer are 2 very different things. By the mid-1990s, Kenya was still an authoritarian state. Investigating powerful figures risked political upheaval. Witnesses were scared. Files disappeared. Even forensic evidence went missing. Every time progress seemed possible, it stalled. And yet, thanks largely to John's persistence, the case refused to disappear. It became a symbol, both in Kenya and the UK, of corruption clashing with determination. John once said that when the police refused to tell him the truth, he simply became the investigator himself. He wasn't driven by vengeance, he was driven by love. Britain and Kenya had a complex relationship in the late 1980s and early 90s. Kenya had gained independence from Britain in 1963, but the influence of formal colonial ties still hovered in the background. British tourists, aid money and business interests pumped huge amounts of money into Kenyan economy. So when a British citizen was murdered there in one of the country's prized tourist reserves, neither government wanted a huge scandal. That tension created this awkward diplomatic dance. The British Foreign Office wanted justice for Julie, or at least to show they cared, but they also didn't want to openly accuse the Kenyan government of corruption or incompetence. Kenya, for its part, wanted the whole thing to go away. For John, this was maddening. He'd sit in government offices listening to polite reassurances, hearing words like sensitivity, diplomatic process and ongoing dialogue. Meanwhile, the reality on the ground was that a murderer was still out there, and officials were refusing to admit it was even a murder. So he took the fight public. He spoke to newspapers, television reporters, anyone who would listen. He gave interviews, brought out his own forensic reports, and started documenting everything in meticulous files. Bit by bit, the case stopped being a quiet local incident and became an international embarrassment. At one point, senior Kenyan officials, including President Moi himself, publicly commented on the case, trying to dismiss it and discredit John. But that strategy backfired, because by then, journalists were paying attention, and every attempted denial only raised more questions. Over those years, John turned into a detective by necessity. He wasn't just chasing clues, he was decoding a system. He kept timelines, precise records of when Julie last spoke to friends, where she'd been seen, what she ate for lunch, and who she met. He created his own investigation dossiers, right down to typographical sketches of the Masai Mara. He even tested weather data to prove that lightning hadn't struck anywhere near her campsite that week. At times, his hostility with Kenyan officials reached breaking point. They accused him of meddling in an active police investigation, which was ironic considering they were barely investigating anything. One officer even suggested privately that John should return home, that these things happen. He did not. And that persistence cost him a lot. His marriage suffered under the stress. He drained his savings travelling back and forth to Kenya. His entire life turned into a campaign for the truth. He also began gaining allies, journalists, British MPs, human rights lawyers, people who saw that his case exposed something bigger. It wasn't only about Julie Ward anymore. It was about how governments fail their citizens when it's diplomatically inconvenienced to find the truth. Eventually, the pressure worked. In 1992, under growing outrage, Kenya allowed detectives from Scotland Yard to assist. It was a turning point. The detectives arrived with modern forensic methods and a reputation for impartiality. They combed over the evidence, interviewed witnesses again, and found, much to no one's surprise, that the Kenyan investigation had been riddled with errors. Some of Julie's possessions had been removed from the evidence room, bones had been mislabelled, photographs went missing or were destroyed. Yet enough material remained for them to make a clear conclusion. This was a murder. Scotland Yard's head investigator, Detective Superintendent David Barber, said publicly that Julie had been killed with a sharp-edged weapon and her body burned afterwards. He also noted that the manner of burning suggested someone with knowledge of the bush, someone who understood how to destroy evidence quickly. But even with all of that, even with the murder established beyond reasonable doubt, getting someone prosecuted was another story. Because the problem wasn't just incompetence, it was obstruction. There were rumours that senior Kenyan figures or their family members might have been in the area at the time. Maybe government officials, maybe their guests. No one could confirm it because records were lost. The implication was simple. Powerful people had something to hide. For Scotland Yard, that was a wall they couldn't climb. Their findings proved murder, but didn't name the killer. And Kenya refused to open new investigations. Publicly, the government thanked Scotland Yard. Privately, they shut the door. As the 90s moved into the 2000s, the Julie Ward case became almost a legend, the symbol of how ordinary citizens sometimes have to do what governments won't. Journalists revisited it every few years, new documentaries, anniversary articles, sometimes even political debates, but nothing ever changed. Kenya went through political reform. Moi finally left power in 2002, but even then, the case stayed cold. Still, John's campaign made lasting ripples. The British Foreign Office updated its procedures for dealing with citizens murdered abroad. The case became part of police training manuals on how to handle international cooperation. It was one of those rare tragedies that reshaped policy in a behind-the-scenes way. And over time, John became something of an icon, this polite yet relentless figure who stood up to cover-ups. He didn't yell or storm officers, he documented, reasoned, persisted. And when doors shut, he knocked again. He was often quoted saying that investigating the case gave him purpose, even in grief. That might sound strange, but for him, truth and memory were all he had left. By 2004, forensic science had advanced quite a bit. There were discussions about re-examining the evidence with newer methods, DNA testing, computer reconstruction of burn patterns, and so on. Some reports suggested that new results confirmed again that human agency, deliberate killing, was undeniable. But Kenya's willingness to reopen the case was fading fast. Every official wanted the file closed. Tourism numbers were strong again, and reminders of a foreign murder didn't help. Still, John didn't let it be forgotten. He published a book, A Gentle Breeze Blowing Through My Life, chronicling his fight for his daughter's memory. It wasn't just about the crime, it was about resilience. That human side, the psychology of a parent-turned-detective, is what keeps the story powerful today. Because when you strip away the politics, at its centre was a young woman in search of adventure, and a father who couldn't bear to let her story end in silence. So what did this case actually change? First, it exposed how fragile justice can be when politics interferes. You'd think a murder would be straightforward, a crime, an investigation, a trial. But when national image, foreign relations and power dynamics step in, that process crumbles. Second, it highlighted the importance of forensic integrity. Without John paying for independent experts, the Kenyan version might never have been challenged. That is chilling, to think official science can be manipulated to fit a government story. Third, and maybe most emotional of all, it showed the endurance of love. John spent more than 30 years pushing for truth. He didn't get justice, not in the courtroom sense, but he got something else, the acknowledgement that his daughter had been wronged. The Julie Ward case isn't just about Kenya in the 80s. It raises deeper questions that still matter today. What happens when a citizen is killed abroad? Who's responsible for getting justice? The host country or the victim's home country? How do you push for truth without trampling on another nation's sovereignty? There's still no perfect answer. Then there's the question of corruption. Kenya wasn't unique in that respect, but Julie's case revealed how corruption doesn't always look like bribes or stolen money. It can be silence. It can be paperwork accidentally lost, evidence casually mislabeled, officials politely discouraging further questions. Sometimes it's very civilized, very quiet, and very deadly for justice. Officially, the murder of Julie Ward remains unsolved. No one has ever been convicted. Scotland Yard's conclusions remain on file. Homicide confirmed, perpetrator unknown. The Kenyan government has occasionally gestured toward reviewing the case, but nothing concrete ever followed. Some media outlets have floated names and theories, possible suspects, possible covers, but without fresh evidence, none are provable. John Ward passed away in 2021 at the age of 89. Even near the end, he continued to advocate for transparency. Friends say he died believing the truth was still out there, waiting to be told. In interviews, he'd often say his goal wasn't revenge, it was recognition. He wanted the record to show what really happened. In a way, he got that. The world does recognise that Julie was murdered. What remains missing is accountability. When I think about this story, I picture two images side by side. On one side, the African savannah, vast, golden and untamed. On the other, John Ward, hunched over piles of documents in a small London office. One scene of freedom and wonder, the other of duty and grief. and between them, the invisible line of love that refused to break. So maybe the best way to end this story isn't with answers, but with lessons. First, the lesson that truth can take decades, and sometimes it never comes easily. Second, that persistence matters, even when you're one person against an entire system. And finally, that memory itself is a form of justice, because as long as people remember Julie's name, the cover-up never fully succeeded.